Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith. I'm off camera today guys because I wanted to go ahead and dive right into this video. I have had tons and tons of people asking me about how to set up their new Sony camera. It seems like lots of people are getting the A7 III and the A7R III, and a lot of folks are coming from Nikon or Canon especially, and they really are very unfamiliar with the controls. I've seen lots of forum posts online where people are basically thinking their cameras are broken, but there's some setting enabled that they're just not familiar with, and there's just been general chaos and craziness. And there's also this sort of impression that these cameras do not have as many physical controls as, their DSLR counterparts. And frankly, I'm a bit sick of that misconception. I've seen even professional review sites complaining on about this, and it's simply not true. So anyways, to help everyone out, I'm going to be making this video to talk to you guys about the controls. Now, if you're coming from Nikon or Canon, as you guys know, I came from Nikon, you will see controls that are very well ingrained. If I look at something like this old school Nikon F100 film camera, it still basically looks like modern day cameras, like say for example a D850, where we have a lot of buttons that do one particular thing, and they always do that same thing. So you can see that we have like ISO and bracketing and flash here, and we have our mode over here, and things along those lines. On a modern day Nikon, it looks the same way. On Canon, it's a similar affair. On Sony though, things are a little bit different. On Sony cameras, they've basically taken more of a sandbox approach to things, and so they basically allow you to customize the camera the way you feel. Suits your needs most. So if you look at one of these cameras, you'll notice that on the top you have C1 and C2. Those are both custom function buttons. We have our C3 back here on the top left, and then we also have a C4 over here. Now, in addition to being able to customize these buttons, you can also customize a lot of the other buttons as well. You cannot customize the display button. It always does display. Let's see, let's go ahead and zoom in a bit here. So that always does display. However, you can customize the right side of this. You can customize the left side of this. You can customize the bottom of this. You can customize what it does when you rotate it. You can also customize what it does whenever you press it in the center. You can customize this four-way joystick toggle here. You can also customize what it does whenever you press straight in on it. You can customize the auto exposure lock. You can customize the AF on. You can customize just about every button on this camera. So I personally like this a little bit more than the sort of like fixed setup on Nikon and Canon. Nikon cameras, for example, have a quality setting on the top of the camera. Whenever I buy a camera, I set it to RAW, and it basically stays there, and that's just a button wasted. So being able to have this approach where we can customize the controls, I find to be a lot better for my type of work. Anyways, as we go into the camera, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you guys have done a lot of the basic things like charging the battery and so on. But anyways, once you do all that stuff, I'm going to show you guys a few things here in the menu. Now, Sony's menus are notoriously complex. However, as you guys are going to find out in this video, after you have the camera set up to your liking, you really don't have to go diving through all these menus very frequently. So that's another misconception I hope I can sort of clear up in this video. But some of the things I do customize in the menu initially would be like the file format. So for example, it's the very first thing here. You can go in here and you can select basically all your different options as far as RAW and JPEG, or just JPEG alone. Now, I will tell you guys, I'm a RAW snob, but you can obviously select these other settings. Down here, you do have the option for doing different types of RAW files. Now, out of all the things on Sony that I did not like over the years, there is only one thing that Sony has not changed, and that is their RAW file type. Now, on Nikon and Canon, you have a RAW format that is that uses what's called lossless compression, which means that they're able to make the RAW file a smaller physical size on the memory card, but they still maintain the quality. Unfortunately, on Sony, we do not have this. This is why we have the option of doing either uncompressed RAW or compressed RAW. Now, I'll tell you guys, the only time in theory where you would see a difference is if you're dealing with a situation with extremely high contrast. Sometimes if you're shooting compressed RAW, you may notice like a bit of an artifact between these harsh and stark, like shadow to highlight transitions. I have not seen that in practice, even shooting compressed RAW. However, I've made the decision to shoot uncompressed all the time because I figure hard drives are cheap, and it would only take one time for me to have that artifact appear to just basically really totally piss me off. So I decided to play it safe and always shoot uncompressed RAW. You guys can, make your decision there. Your mileage may vary. Right below this, you have the option of setting your different JPEG quality settings. You have extra fine, fine, and standard. All these settings basically just change not how many pixels you're recording, but these change how compressed the file is. So you're still going to be recording, in this case, 42 megapixels, but if you do like, a different quality level, you're going to compress that data more. So to get the best quality here out of a JPEG, you want to go over here and go to extra fine. Then down here, you have JPEG image size, and this is actually where you would go if you wanted to change the actual amount of pixels you're capturing. Now, frankly, I don't know why anyone would ever do this on any camera, because you can always make a file smaller, but you can't make it bigger. As I mentioned, hard drives, memory cards are cheap. I recommend leaving this set to the highest resolution, and you can always downsample it later if need be. But if you get a great shot and you were shooting in the small size, you would limit that image's usefulness if you were set to a small size. So I recommend leaving it on the high setting, but you can change it if you want to. Now, this does not change the RAW files at all. So on Sony cameras, it's only possible to record RAWs at the full resolution. You cannot go to lower than the camera's max resolution there. Right down below here, you can change your aspect ratio. Most people are going to stick with 3:2 there. You also have a crop mode here. This is something that is a little more useful in terms of video shooting, in my opinion. And I decided to make a setup video completely separate from this one for the video stuff, because that would make this video too long. But we'll talk about that in the video aspect of things later on in a future video. If you wanted to be able to change this in still shooting, basically it would allow you to have a 1.5 times crop factor. You'd get a little bit more reach out of your lenses. It would lower your resolution though. So in the case of something like an A7R III, you're going to get about an 18 megapixel picture. Now you'll notice under this option, you do have the ability to go in here and have this APS-C crop center mode, either on auto or manual. On this particular camera system, you can mount a crop center or a full frame lens. It's just like Nikon. On Canon, you cannot put a crop center lens on a full frame camera. On Sony and on Nikon, you can. So if you have this on auto and you put a crop center lens on, the camera will automatically go over into that APS-C crop mode if it detects that crop center lens attached. Otherwise, if you want to manually change this, you have to go over to manual. And then it's a little bit weird, I know, but down here there's another setting that basically says, okay, now that you have enabled the ability to choose, this is actually how you go and choose that you want to be in crop mode. So you have to switch this over to on. And now we would actually be in APS-C crop mode. As you guys can see, the maximum resolution is now 18 megapixels. Now this is a little bit of an interesting thing. This is actually the only way that you could shoot a lower resolution RAW file. You could actually put it in APS-C crop mode, and then you would get these 18 megapixel RAW files. So that's a little bit of a workaround. I have done that at one event that I shot. I actually put my 16-70 f4 crop center lens on to the R3 and put it into that crop mode and got a little bit lower resolution RAW file that way. So that's a unique workaround if you're interested in shooting lower resolution RAWs. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this back to how I had it set. And we'll take a look at a couple other things. Now, I am going to show you guys the video quality settings, but I'm not going to really go into a lot of video stuff in this video. You'll notice that basically everything that relates to still shooting is under camera menu 1. Camera menu 2 is going to be more video stuff here. So if you go over here, under file format, you have a few options here. You cannot do a MP4 alone with this camera, or with this 7 III, you have the choice of doing an XAVC type codec in 4K or in 1080. That's going to be your better quality video. That's going to give you 100 megabit per second stream. And then AVC HD, going to be much more compressed file. That's how that works out. Down here we have our frame rates we can choose from. We can do either 24 or 30 if we are doing 4K. If we're doing 1080, the camera lets you go up all the way to the maximum of 120 frames per second. So that's how that works out. I don't ever use the 120 frame a second option unless I'm setting fire to a Nikon camera. So I usually leave it set to 4K at 24. If you do want to do a MP4 file, that way you can basically upload a file straight to YouTube without any editing. You can go in here and you can turn on the proxy recording. It's kind of like shooting JPEG plus RAW whenever you're doing still photos. But if you turn that on, that will basically allow you to go in and record, 2 different versions of every clip. So you'll have your higher quality XAVC, and then you'll have your sort of like more web friendly and instant share friendly MP4 file. Okay, so that's how that works out. Now, there are a few other things that I recommend people change on these cameras whenever you're setting them up. And a lot of these things don't necessarily apply if you're shooting RAW, but I'm going to talk about these anyway. One thing that Sony has is something called dynamic range optimization. And you guys are going to have to forgive me. I'm going to actually bounce around a little bit in the menus. I'm going to try not to bounce around too much. But anyways, there will be some sort of like scrolling through things. This is the dynamic range optimization right here. Basically, if you're familiar with Nikon, this is kind of like what Nikon would call auto delighting. I'm not sure what Canon calls it, but basically what this does is it tries to artificially boost the dynamic range of the camera. It tries to really bring out details, especially in the shadow regions of the image. If you turn this on, the camera is basically doing, in-camera processing. You can see that mine is turned off. I usually always leave this off. Down here, you can turn it on if you would rather have that set. You can have it set to auto, and you can, or you can change the level to something else. And it's just very, very good if you're shooting, perhaps JPEGs and you don't have as much experience processing your files, but you still want to get that more wide dynamic range look. You can also come down here and you can do auto HDR, where the camera will actually do some blending in camera and do multiple exposures. Do notice that mine is grayed out right now, and that is because I am currently in RAW. If I were to go back over and change the camera to JPEG, you guys will see that that option will become available to me. So we'll go over there and we'll go back to where we were and actually go ahead, and you can see we can go ahead and enable it now. So you can go in here and you can set your exposure difference between all the frames. That's how that works out. I'm not much of an HDR fan, and I'm not really the type of shooter that would use HDR, but if you do, that's where it is. Okay, so let's see here. We'll jump right back over and go to RAW again. And yes, in case anyone is wondering, I did practice this before I filmed it. That's how I'm going through all these menus very, very quickly. I am going to get to how you guys can set up this camera to where you don't have to dive through the menus as often. Something else that I like to change on these cameras, and this is something, if you like to do a lot of nighttime photography, or long exposure type work, this is something that you might want to put in the spot on the camera where it's easier to get to, so you don't have to go to it every time. We'll talk about that a bit later. But the setting I'm speaking of here is the long exposure noise reduction, which we actually passed a while ago. So it's right here. Basically, this is dark frame noise reduction. What essentially happens is, if you're doing a very, very long exposure, say you're doing a 5-second exposure, you would go ahead and make that exposure, and right after that exposure has been captured, the camera would turn around and make another 5-second exposure and basically look for the noise pattern and then intelligently subtract it out in camera. So that's how that works out. It is my understanding that that does affect RAW files and JPEG files. So if you're doing a lot of long exposure work, you might actually end up using this, but be aware if you do, all your exposures are going to take twice as long. So that's a reason to turn it off in a lot of cases. Okay, so what else do we have here? A lot of people talk about color spaces. We have sRGB and Adobe RGB. This is something that probably needs its own video, but basically these different color spaces determine how a camera is able to capture variations of color. If you set your camera to Adobe RGB, you'll simply capture more variations in color tones, especially in the reds. Now, because I shoot in RAW 24/7, I never worry about this setting at all. I always leave the camera on sRGB. And the reason for that is because if you're shooting RAW, this is actually changed by the RAW converter and not by the camera. So if you're shooting in RAW, this is really not something you have to worry about a lot. If you're shooting JPEG, you may want to use Adobe RGB. Just be aware though that this is going to be better for editing and for printing. If you take an image that's Adobe RGB and you upload it directly to the web, it is not going to display the colors properly. So keep that in mind. Okay, so what else? One other thing that I always look at on Sony cameras is the audio signals. Now, back in the past, I liked my beep. I love to set my cameras to where whenever I have pressed the shutter button, they would beep to let me know that the image is in focus. Because of the way Sony's focusing system works, I no longer do that. I can easily tell with the electronic viewfinder when the camera is going to produce an in-focus image. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. So the beep is pretty annoying on these cameras. There is an option in the menu called audio signals. So there's our audio signals right here over on custom operation 2. So we just go down and we can turn that off. So that way you don't get that annoying beep every single time that the camera locks focus. So it's much, much easier to work with there. Another thing on these cameras that frankly screwed me up for quite a while was the auto brightness of the electronic viewfinder. A lot of times I'd find myself, sort of like ending up with a little bit different exposures. Every camera exposes images a little bit differently, but having the auto dimming of the viewfinder turned on kind of, made it hard for me to adapt. So I recommend turning this off. So yeah, I definitely recommend going in here and setting this viewfinder brightness to manual. You just go down to it right here. It prompts you to look through the display to change everything. But anyways, you can go between auto and between manual there, and it's much, much easier to work with from there on out. The next thing you'll notice here is that there's actually some different settings that pertain to the monitor. Right now, I have this set to sunny weather, just so that it's actually possible for you guys to be able to see what I'm filming on the screen, even with my bright video lights. But in practice, I usually set this over to just the manual setting like this and leave it to 0, which looks pretty dim here. In practice, it isn't. If you are in sunny weather, you can do this. Be aware though that it basically chews through your battery a lot more. I find myself leaving the display on standard and then just using the electronic viewfinder if I'm in very, very bright overhead lights. A few other things that pertain to the display that are useful would be actually over on this side of the camera menu. And this is the option to actually change the quality and the frame rate. So right down here, you'll notice that you have the option for finder frame rate. By default, if memory serves correct, this is not actually set to high. I always go in and set this to the high setting to get much, much better refresh out of the viewfinder. So that's an option. It does apparently affect battery life some, but in practice, I have not actually noticed it affect anything. Something else that's useful here is a actual setting for the quality of the monitor itself. And you guys notice that this one is frustratingly in a little bit different spot. It's actually over in the setup menu under setup 2, and you can see it says display quality, and I now have mine set to high. So that's something that I did as well that makes a big difference. Now, you guys have seen me go through a lot of these different settings, And you guys have noticed that a lot of the stuff is pretty sprawled out in all the menus, and you're thinking, my God, I'll never get used to that. That's way, way confusing. But I mentioned that customization early on. So the first line of customization on these cameras, as I previously mentioned, is the custom buttons. Now, by default, a lot of these I found to be set up pretty well. New to this series of cameras is the ability to now go in and customize what the buttons do when you're in different parts of the camera. So basically that means that you can go in and you can set up one function if you're shooting stills, you can set up another function if you're shooting video, and then you can set up another function still if you're doing like your image playback. So by default, C1 up here on top of the camera, this one right here, actually does the white balance. And this is the default setting. And I find it to be very useful right there. So you guys can go through here. You have all the same white balance settings you would expect to see on any other camera. Nothing special here. That's how that works out. C2, right over here, this one allows us to go in and change our focus area mode. So basically that's going to be where the camera looks in the scene to determine focus. And once again, I find this to be pretty good in the default settings. Now, if we start speaking about face detection and eye detection, that is something that's completely separate from the area modes on the camera. And face detection and eye detection on Sony cameras end up being overridden by, or they end up overriding all the options that you see here. So that's something that I'm not going to get into this video. I'll actually make another video in the future to discuss that with you. But that's how that is. I find it to be very good on its default. C3 over here allows you to go in and do your focus drive mode. So this is going to be how the focus system behaves. So you have like your single servo focus here. You have your automatic, where it basically tries to guess between, is your subject moving, is your subject stationary. Then you have continuous focus right here. So this is basically like Canon AI servo. Then you have something called DMF, and DMF is what stands for direct manual focus. Basically, this is a focus override. So how this works is, let's say that you go in and you have pressed your shutter button, or you press your AF on button, and you want to go in and you want to, override your focus. If you're on DMF, right after you have pressed and locked that focus initially, you can come back and then fine tune your focus. Just after you go in, just after you, have pressed. So that's how that works out. And then of course you have your option to do manual focusing down here as well. So that's going to be at the very, very bottom. Some Sony lenses have an autofocus, manual focus switch. If yours does, you will never have to switch to this option. If your lens does not, then you'll go in here and change it. So that's how that works out. Back here on the back of the camera, you have the ability to change your drive modes. So if you press this button right here, this takes you to the ability to go in here and do like single shot versus continuous. You'll notice that some of these options have a little sort of left and right toggle. So you'll notice that whenever I come down here, it says that it's on high right now. But if I come in and go left and right, or use my little joystick to go left and right, you can go between things like high, you can do mid, you can do low, and you can do high plus. So you can affect the actual frame rate you're going to get there. Then you have your self-timer mode, and then you have your continuous self-timer, where basically you're able to set a certain period for the self-timer, but then you're able to tell the camera to take a certain amount of shots. This is also where you find your bracketing options down here. So you can go in here to your bracket, and you can go in and you can do bracketing on continuous shooting like this, and you can go left and right and change how many frames you have, as well as the EV difference between each frame. If you go to the next option, this is bracketing with a single shot. So you have to press the shutter button every time as opposed to holding, and that allows you to change that. You can even do white balance bracketing here, or you can do DRO bracketing as well. So you've got a lot of different options there. Over on the right side of this is your ISO. At least it is by default. And I've actually left this as ISO as well. Now, something I discovered here, and this is something that, frankly, I could have known about if I had just read, but You'll notice here that if you go in and you press that button and you rotate the command wheel at the back, you're actually changing things in third stop increments. However, if you want to change things at a full stop increment, you'll notice the camera actually tells you that if you want to do a full stop increment, it shows you a symbol for that dial, which is actually talking about the dial back here. But if you go to this dial in the back, you can actually jump in full stop increments. So you can make it through these settings much, much faster if you do that, or you can do thirds like right here. So that's how that works out. Now, in terms of customization, I have my camera set up to where if I rotate this dial, I can actually go in and, just change it directly without having to press anything else. So basically I have 3 dials. I have a front dial for aperture, have the back dial for shutter speed, and I have this dial back here for my ISO. And this is something you can set up that we're going to discuss in just a moment. So that's how that works out. Now, if we want to go in and start talking about customizing all these different functions, we go into our menu here. That moment is now here. So if we go into our menu here, we can go over to the next to last option on menu 2. And you can see it says custom key, custom key, custom key. This first option is for still photos. So if you want to do a custom option for stills, you can go right there. If you want to do a custom key for video, you go right here. If you want to do a custom key for playback, you go right here. Okay, so we'll start out right with the custom key option for stills. So if we go to that, you see that we basically just have lots and lots of options here for all of our different buttons. As I previously mentioned, I have the ISO set to the control wheel. But if we were to select this, we just have almost endless amounts of options here. So we can change a lot of different things about this setup. If you're coming from Canon, you might even want to go in there and change this this wheel to do something like your aperture, so that way you can match Canon setup. So there's a lot of things you can do. There's even more things that you can do with the custom buttons. You can see there's actually 23 different pages of settings that I could assign to custom button 1 if I wanted to. So we have lots and lots of ability here. So what I'm basically saying here is, if you have a function that you change a lot and you don't want to delve into the menu, then set it to a custom button. The custom button is going to be your main thing that you want to set up first, because that's going to allow you to change the things that are highest priority on your list. You can see we also have the ability to go in here and either have the custom video keys follow the same function as they do in stills, or we can go in here and we can have them do something different. So you can see that I actually have my custom button 3 to go into the APS-C crop mode whenever I'm shooting video. And we could do that same thing with pretty much all these other buttons as well. So it's pretty nice how that's set up. Now, these are mostly the same. However, when we start to get into some of these other ones, this is more of where I've customized a little bit more. I did program the down button to do my silent shooting, just because this is something that I like to use occasionally. And it's something that I'll need to be able to change fairly easily here, so I put it on that option. Another one that I did in here that's pretty big is this thing called Shot Result Preview. And this is something that deserves its own video. But basically, I've noticed a lot of photographers have complained about Sony exposure simulation whenever you're using flash. Basically, whenever you're going in and you're changing all your different settings, exposure settings, you see in real time that exposure adjustment reflected in your viewfinder and on your screen. However, the moment you put a flash on, the camera turns the exposure simulation off and you just always get a neutral effect, and you basically just have to use your meter just like you would on any other camera. Well, this shot result preview option is really cool because it allows you to basically press a button and get the preview of what things would look like with just ambient light. And then when you let go of the button, it goes back to just being this level exposure that you would normally get with your flash attached. So this is something very, very easy for me to do whenever I'm shooting with flash, because I like to go in there and I like to hold down that button and see where my ambient light is going to be in the scene. And whenever I let go, then it goes back to just the neutral non-exposure preview view. So that's how that works out. So that's something I'll talk about in another video. And everything else is mostly the same here. Over here, we do see more customization I've done. So if we start talking about, the autofocus on button, basically it does its same function. This is what you use for back button focusing. But I do have Sony's eye detection tied to my auto exposure lock button. And as I mentioned before, the eye detection is totally independent of your other focus area modes. Your eye detect focus will never happen with like a press of the AF on, or like, just a half press of the shutter ordinarily. You actually have to press a button to initiate it separately from the regular focus system. So on my camera, I find it to be easiest to do that here. If I want to regularly focus without eye detection, I half press or I press the AF on. If not, I migrate my thumb over to the auto exposure lock button, and that's how that works out. So once again, that's something that deserves another tutorial video in the future. Down here, we have the focus hold button. You notice I have this set to none, or set to not set. And focus hold is the button that is on the side of Sony lenses. Like if you have, say, for example, an 85 1.4 G Master, or if you have something like, say, a 70 to 200 2.8, any of those lenses basically are set up to where they have a focus hold button. I used to have this set up to be my IAF as well, but basically I discovered that I would accidentally hit the button, and I would be trying to do something else with the camera and I'd be inadvertently pressing that button and it would not do what I was expecting it to do. So I have since disabled the focus hold button. I find that I don't use it, and I prefer to use my eye detection back here. So that's how that works out. The other thing that I have customized is I have one button customized under the playback menu, and this allows you to go in here and actually customize things like your rating of images, for example. So right here, you'll notice that button 1 and 2 follow the custom. Button 3, which is this one over here, I actually have it set up to be the rating. And by default, this actually protects the image. So it just kind of locks it and prevents you from deleting it on your memory card. But by going in here and rating and setting it to rating, you can assign a star preview to your images very easily. This is something that is not possible on the A9, and I hope that Sony changes that very, very soon. But I'll give you guys a quick little demo of how this works. Hold on one second. My camera is not set to the right exposure. All right, I'll take a couple of pictures of my very, very uber attractive Netgear router with all of its lovely fingerprints on it. So there we go. So we have basically things set up here. If I come in and press this button, you can see that now as I press it, I am assigning a star rating. So that's how that works out. So let's see. Let me take a picture of something else. I have a very attractive shredder over there. I think it's a bit more attractive than the router. So I can go in here and I could assign a star rating to this. Now, the other thing that I discovered is that you can customize, you can actually go in and customize things like the other command dials on the camera in Playback too. So for example here, I actually have it set up to where I can go in and if I am rating my images, this is actually something that's not under the custom key settings, but if you go over to your Playback menu here, there's an option that says image jump setting. And if you go to image jump setting, you can basically select the dial that you want to do your image jumping with. I programmed it to the front dial, but I have it programmed to just jump through the images that are rated, which is pretty cool. So I have it set to where it's just the 5-star images. And you know what this is very useful for? This is useful if I'm taking photos of a client and I suddenly want to go in and, show them just the 5-star images. How many times have you been showing people images on your camera and, you end up scrolling through things and they end up seeing something that you didn't want them to see? This is how I prevent that. So quick little demo here. I took a few more frames here. You guys can see all the frames that I have. There's my router, there's my shredder that I gave 5-star images to. And this is not a Nikon video, so we don't really want to see a Nikon camera. Let's just say we wanted to scroll through all the images that I rated. So since I have that programmed to the front dial, I can come up here to just my front dial, and when I rotate my front dial, it's now going to just jump through the images that have a 5-star rating. And see, it's skipping over all the ones that are not rated. So I thought that was pretty slick. That's something that I found in the camera much later, and it's something that I haven't seen anyone else talk about. So that's something you guys might find very useful also. So there's lots of little small things in this camera. I definitely encourage, I definitely encourage taking the camera to bed so you can sit there and, instead of that nightly reading in a book, you can study your camera. You'll find all kinds of cool things. But this is just some stuff that I find useful here. The next thing outside of the customizable buttons that's on this camera that I use to kind of get to settings I need is my second line of defense, which is the function menu, the effing menu. Okay, lame joke. Anyways, the function menu is basically accessed with this button here. You press this button, and then you have all your settings down here. Now, by default, there are some pretty useful things back here, but once again, this is something that can be customized. So for me, one thing that I find myself changing a lot is the face and eye detection. Well, sorry, not eye detection, but face detection rather. Now this face detection setting, and once again, this is something I'm going to talk about in a future video, but this face detection setting allows the camera to automatically lock onto a face whenever you have press or whenever you press the AF on. And this will override the selected focus area. So basically, if you have a focus point on one area in the screen, but then it detects a face in another part, it's going to jump to the face and it's going to override where that focus point is. I use this mostly in video mode. I usually never use this in stills. This is something I find sort of throws people off. So the ability to go in here and turn this off so it doesn't automatically jump to another face and override your focus point is very, very useful. So I like to have it here to where I can turn it off easily. Then you have your area modes here. I have the picture profiles down here. This is mostly for shooting video. I like to shoot a lot of my videos in PP2, so I have that set there. Another big one for me, let's see, ISO is there. The metering is good to have it there. Every once in a while I'll change the metering mode. I don't find myself changing metering a ton on Sony cameras, just because on Sony, you see that instant exposure preview in the viewfinder and everything with it being a mirrorless camera, so I don't change it much. But it is there if I want to change it. Something else I change here a lot is the wireless flash option. This is something I change constantly because I use lots of flash. So being able to go in here and enable or disable this is nice. This is something else that people get tripped up on. If you are using a flash trigger, a ProPhoto Air, or if you're using, the Godox system or any flash system, even Sony's own, radio flash trigger, if you're using any of those systems, they will not work unless you turn the wireless flash function on. So I have that option set right here. So that's how that works out. Then we have our memory card selector here. You can prioritize between slot 1 and slot 2. That's something I do fairly often. Of course, the file format is right here, so I don't have to go into the menu for it. The creative styles, that's basically just going to be like if you wanted to do like in-camera black and whites and stuff. Sometimes I actually turn the in-camera black and white on here because even in RAW, you can get a nice preview of what it's going to look like in black and white. And when you transfer over your RAW, you still get all the color data. And that's something I used to do on Nikon a lot, so I like having the ability to change that here. Of course, white balance. And then I have my flash exposure compensation right here as well. So everything is set up pretty nicely there. For the things that are not priority enough to be assigned to a button or assigned to this function menu. Actually, before I get to that, let me just actually show you guys how to change the function menu. So you'll notice that over here, we'll go over to our custom operation again, and there's the function menu set. So basically you can go in here and you can assign what's on the upper row and what's on the lower row pretty easily once again. So you can see how we can change all that. I would like to see Sony give us the option to customize this menu, more like the way the keys are set up. It would be nice to have it set to where we could have one set of options for stills and one set of options for video. But hey, you know, maybe in the future. This allows you to rotate the dials around. So if you don't want your aperture up here and your shutter speed back there, like if you're a Canon user, you might want to go in there and change this around so you can make it more like what you're used to. So all in all, pretty straightforward. At the very, very lowest level of the priority sort of customization for me would be the My Menu setting. So basically, if something is not important enough to warrant it being assigned to a button, and it's not important enough to be assigned to the function menu, then it ends up in My Menu. And this is stuff that I still need to be able to change without hunting through all the menus, but this is not something I'm going to need to be able to change like at the ready. Like I would some of the other settings that I would change while I'm actually shooting. So the main thing would be the format. You know, this is something I always do. Every time I put in a card I'm ready to clear off or a brand new card, I always go in and format. So that's the main thing that's at the very top of my menu option. The next thing is record media settings. And this allows me to go in here and change how the dual card slots are going to be utilized. So you guys can see this is basically all just stuff that I would do in preparation for a shoot. I don't want to hunt through the menus to get to it, but I'm not going to change it like actually while I'm shooting. But you can go in here and do things like do simultaneous recording. So if I wanted to do a backup of my images, I could do, for example, simultaneous stills. And you can see now that we have still images being recorded to both cards. It would be the exact same still images. And then you can even do like, you know, RAW plus JPEG options and so on, and sort those out. If you want to go ahead and do RAW and JPEG, be sure that you go back to the camera's quality setting from earlier and change it to RAW plus JPEG before you go in here and set it for the RAW and JPEG setting in the menu. You can also turn on the auto switch, so that way if it fills up one card, it will jump to the next. So all those settings that pertain to cards are basically found there. There's that RAW option. Although I leave it on uncompressed 99% of the time, there's been a few times where I did go over to the compressed RAW. There's my APS-C Super 35 crop mode. There's our AF illuminator, which is something that I usually leave turned off, but you know, there's been a few times where I've needed it, so I'll turn it on. This is the live view setting effect. And by default, it turns off whenever you put a flash on. You cannot turn it on. That's why I have this button over here assigned to that setting, our shot result preview, rather. But a lot of times if I'm shooting with available light, sometimes I don't want to have the exposure preview turned on. So that's why I go ahead and turn that off there. We also have the control to smartphone option. Basically, after me working on this My Menu customization a few times, this is the third iteration of it that you're seeing. So I kind of tried to group things in a logical fashion. So I put everything that pertains to the wireless kind of on, or like wireless transfer of images kind of like on this tab 2 here. So I have the option for controlling with smartphone. I have my PC remote settings. This is something that I change a lot whenever I'm going in and shooting tethered. Sometimes I want those images to be stored to the computer and I want them to be stored to the memory card. Sometimes I just want them to go to the computer. So this allows me to go in here and change that very, very easily. If you guys are curious about more of the sort of Wi-Fi setup options, definitely check out my Wi-Fi setup video for these cameras. It will walk you through all those steps, but that's where I keep this. USB's power supply, by default, if you're plugged into a USB port, going to a computer, you know, it will go ahead and charge the battery in the camera too. Sometimes if my laptop is not running from AC power, I don't want to drain my laptop battery faster, so I'll go in there and turn that off. You can change your USB connection to different things too. Mostly mine stays on PC remote because I do lots of tethered shooting, but you can also go to mass storage if you're going to transfer your images, to the computer and that sort of thing. So that's how all that works out. The electronic first curtain shutter. This is something that deserves a lot more discussion. Basically, if I'm shooting in a situation where I'm using high-speed sync, I will turn this off. Sometimes using high-speed sync at very high shutter speeds with the electronic first curtain turned on can result in some banding in images. It's a rare thing, but if you're using lots and lots of high-speed sync, I recommend turning the electronic first curtain off. And once again, this is something we can talk about in another video. This is the flash mode. Usually this is going to stay on fill flash for most people, but if you want to do something like, say you want to do something like slow sync or rear sync, this is how you turn this on. So in most cases, I leave this on fill flash. It used to be that you couldn't combine the wireless flash option, which I have in that function menu, with one of these flash modes. But now since Sony's kind of decoupled both those, you can go in there and turn on the wireless flash mode while still being able to simultaneously go in here and go to like rear sync and slow sync and that sort of thing. So that's what happens with that. But since I don't change it often, I actually took it out of the function menu and put it in here. And then we have steady shot. It's still best to turn the steady shot off if you're going to be on a tripod. If your lens has built-in steady shot optical stabilization, if you flip the lens off, if you flip that steady shot off on the lens, it does also disable it in the camera. But if you're using a lens that does not have stabilization built in, that's where this menu option comes in handy. So I've seen some people get confused by that too, so be aware of that. Another thing that I noticed on these cameras is that the auto white balance performance was not as good as what it was on Nikon whenever I was under artificial lights. And I've heard a lot of people mention this online. A lot of people were saying that they're getting getting images that were much more yellow than their previous camera. But then I discovered this setting on the Sonys, and it basically makes it work just as well as any other camera I've used. By default, this auto white balance priority is on standard, but if you're shooting under very yellow lights and you want those yellow light sources to appear more white, you can go in here and change this white balance priority. You can see that you can basically prioritize maintaining more of the ambience, or you can maintain more of a white look. So if you're under very yellow lights, go in here, change this to white. You'll be much, much happier with these cameras' auto white balance performance. So I have this mostly set to standard, but I have it in the menu just a couple button presses away in case I need to change it. Anti-flicker shooting. This times the camera's mechanical shutter to the refresh rate of different artificial lights and reduces banding and that sort of thing. I put it in here. I have yet to use this setting one time, so maybe I'll take it out. I never use it, but that's what it does. You can do face registration as well. That's something that deserves its own video. But anyways, I have it here at the ready also. And then you can go over here and you can add items and delete items and rearrange and all that. But so far, I've been very, very happy with the setup of how things are. Anyways, guys, obviously we went through lots of things. Oh yeah, by the way, I'll mention one other thing. By default, whenever I'm shooting, I'll leave this display just on live view. And of course, when I raise it to my eye, it switches over to the viewfinder. One thing I've noticed though is, if you want to be able to save a bit of battery life, you can actually set this over to just this screen right here. And that way, the live view is not actually on until you raise your eye to the viewfinder. It does cause a little bit more lag whenever the live view comes on in the viewfinder, but I've noticed that it does save a bit of battery life. Not that these cameras really have bad battery life, but if you are interested in that, I noticed shooting a wedding that a lot of times my camera would be hanging at my side and the live view would just be on for no good reason. So setting it to this menu kind of solved that in a lot of scenarios. But anyways, I know this video has been very, very long. Obviously, we hit a lot of points that can be expanded on. If you guys, want to see more videos, just let me know what aspects of the camera you'd like me to go into more detail about. Don't forget to follow my work on social media. I am known as Photog J the Great. Although I could probably say I'm Photog J the Great Talker today, because I've talked a ton in this video. But anyways, don't forget to follow me on social media, you know, all those popular things, Instagram, Facebook, and keep up with my work that way. Don't forget to write me in the comments below, let me know what else you'd like to see, and let me know if you have questions. Until next time, this is Jeremy Smith, signing off.